Imagine being inside a ship so low that the sea seems to walk right over it. The water slams against the deck, runs across the iron plates, and cracks against the rivets. Inside, men breathe hot air mixed with coal, oil, and fear. Now imagine that this metal box has to face a larger creature, fresh from a massacre. An enemy ship that has already proven one simple thing. The old wooden warships had become the past. And that is the part that changes everything. Because that small, strange, almost ugly ship was not built to look glorious. It was built to stop a catastrophe. It was born before the technology was ready, before engines were truly reliable, before rotating turrets became standard, before sailors understood how to survive inside a floating machine. And still it was sent to war. For centuries, war at sea had a familiar face. Huge wooden ships, tall masts, open sails, cannons along the sides, and crews running across boards soaked with gunpowder and blood. A warship was almost a fortress with the soul of a forest. But tradition does not stop a cannonball forever. In the 19th century, the world on land was already changing too fast. Factories were spitting smoke. Rails were cutting through cities. Steam engines were pushing machines and armies forward. But at sea, many commanders still thought like their grandfathers. Wood still seemed noble. Sails still seemed safe. Rows of cannons still seemed like the answer to everything. Until a monster covered in iron appeared. It looked like a dark roof floating on the water, heavy, threatening, almost wrong. But when it entered combat, beauty stopped mattering. Shots struck the armor and bounced away. Enemy would split, burned, and sank. Men who believed they were protected realized they were trapped inside flammable boxes facing the future. That shock was more than military. It was psychological. Suddenly, everyone understood that a single armored vessel could destroy blockades, protect ports, and change the course of a war. There was no time to wait for years of testing. The answer had to be born quickly, almost out of panic. That was the climate where an absurd idea appeared. An engineer named John Ericsson presented a project that seemed to insult the naval logic of the time. A low iron ship powered by steam, with almost nothing above the waterline and a round tower in the center. Instead of carrying dozens of cannons along its sides, it would carry only a few cannons inside an armored turret that could rotate. That way, the ship would not need to turn its whole body to aim. The weapon would turn by itself. Today, that sounds normal. Back then, it sounded like a provocation, because traditional ships shouted power through size. Ericsson was whispering power through design. Less height to be hit, more iron to resist, fewer cannons but better positioned. Less like a castle, more like a trap. But there was one question no one could swallow. Would that thing actually work? The deck sat too close to the sea. One aggressive wave could cover everything. The crew would be hidden inside the hull, with no wind on their faces, no horizon. In there, the ship would be a metal throat. Heat, steam, noise, darkness. Men trying to operate cannons while the turret turned and the ocean hammered from the outside. And there was still another problem. Everything depended on the machine. If the engine failed, there was no sail to save the situation. If the turret jammed, its greatest advantage became dead weight. If the ventilation could not keep up, the crew would be beaten before the enemy ever finished them. The ship was brilliant, but it was also a walking risk. An armed experiment. A bet with cannons. Even so, the project was accepted. Not because everyone believed in it, but because fear had pressed a knife against the throat of the war. The enemy had already shown that Wood could die in a matter of hours. So that strange ship began to be built with urgent rhythm. Iron plates, rivets, engines, pipes, turret, cannons, every piece being fitted together as if time were charging interest in blood. Its name was simple: Monitor. No imperial name, no grand title. Monitor. Cold, short, almost bureaucratic. But behind that name was a revolution ready to trip over its own screws. When it was finished, it looked too small for its mission. It was just over 50 meters long and almost disappeared on the surface of the water. From a distance, it was a shadow with a turret. A strange object that did not fit the naval imagination of that time. The trip to combat almost proved its critics right. In open sea, the Monitor suffered. Waves passed over the deck. Water found its way in. The pumps worked without rest. Inside, every blow seemed like a warning. You should not be here. The ship that was supposed to save a fleet almost could not save itself. Before facing the enemy, it had to face the ocean. When it finally reached the battlefield, it did not arrive like a shining hero. It arrived tired, wet, tested, and still it arrived. On the other side was the armored monster that had already destroyed wooden ships and spread panic. That encounter was not just a fight between two vessels. It was a trial of the future. One improvised iron ship against another experimental ship. When the two ships met, no one knew exactly how that battle was supposed to happen. For centuries, war at sea had followed an almost predictable ritual. Approach, line up the hull, open fire from the sides, try to break the masts, tear through wood, set the enemy on fire, and pray your own ship stayed whole. But now there was no ritual. There was iron staring down iron. On one side, the Monitor moved forward low, almost disappearing into the water, like a shadow with cannons. On the other, the enemy ship looked like a dark floating wall, larger, heavier, with the appearance of something made to crush anything it touched. And the strangest part was that neither of them seemed to fully belong to that era. The battle began with an uncomfortable feeling. The shots landed, but they did not decide anything. On wooden ships, a good shot could open the hull, knock men down, scatter splinters, start fires, and turn the deck into chaos. Here it was different. The cannonball struck the armor, and the sound went through everything. It was not just noise. It was a physical blow. Inside the Monitor, every impact made the metal vibrate as if the men were trapped inside a giant bell. The rotating turret was the big gamble. For that time, it seemed almost absurd. A regular ship had to turn its whole body to aim. The Monitor did not. The turret turned on its own, searching for the target while the hull kept maneuvering. It was a simple idea but revolutionary. For the first time, the weapon was starting to separate itself from the movement of the ship. But the turret was not perfect. It was heavy, slow, loud, and hard to control. When it turned, the gunners lost their sense of direction. Smoke from the shots invaded everything. The heat rose. The space was tight. The men loaded the cannons with effort, fired, and tried to understand where the turret had ended up pointing after the recoil. It was new technology working by sheer force of will. And still it worked. The Monitor approached, fired, pulled back, repositioned. The enemy answered. The two struck each other without managing to destroy each other for good. It was almost frustrating to watch. Two iron monsters hurting each other, but not bleeding the way old ships used to bleed. And that was exactly the revolution. The Monitor's goal was not to look invincible. It was to stop the enemy from continuing to destroy wooden ships. And minute after minute, it proved it could do that job. Small, strange, uncomfortable, and full of flaws, it stayed there. It did not sink. It did not run. It did not break apart. But every invention that arrives too early charges a price. Visibility was poor. Communication inside was confusing. The commander had to make decisions with little information, surrounded by smoke, noise, and constant impacts. There was no tradition for this. No one had learned in their youth how to command an armored turret inside a hull almost swallowed by the water. Everything was improvisation. At one point, trying to see the fight more clearly, the commander was exposed near the pilot house. The enemy fired. The impact hit the structure with violence. Fragments and pressure injured his eyes. Suddenly, the machine that depended on coordination lost the clear vision of the man guiding it. Imagine the kind of fear that creates. You are inside an iron experiment, facing a larger enemy. In a battle no one in the world has real experience fighting, and the person who should guide everything is wounded. There is nothing beautiful in that scene. There is smoke. There is pain. There is someone trying to understand if he can still keep going. Even so, the Monitor did not disappear from the battle. It pulled back, reorganized, and continued to be a threat. The enemy realized that this low ship was a real obstacle. It was not elegant. It was not perfect. But it was blocking the path. And in that moment, blocking was already changing history. In the end, the battle did not have a clean victory, the kind that is easy to explain in one sentence. No one left with the enemy destroyed and the sea silent. But the result was bigger than an ordinary victory. Wooden warships were condemned. After that encounter, every naval commander had to face a bitter truth. War at sea no longer belonged only to sails, masts, and tradition. It now belonged to iron, steam, rotating turrets, coal, engineering, and men locked inside noisy machines. But there was a cruel irony. The Monitor had defeated the logic of the past, but it had not defeated nature. It was brilliant for a specific mission, in controlled waters against a specific enemy. But it was still too low, too enclosed, too dependent on pumps, engines, sealing, and luck. And at sea, luck never stays on the same deck for long. Months later, when it had to face more aggressive waters, its flaws truly began to show. Waves passed over the deck. Water found cracks. The pumps worked without rest. The same design that made the Monitor hard to hit in combat made it vulnerable in a storm. The crew tried to save the ship. They fought against the water, against the weight, against the darkness, and against the fear of dying inside a machine the world was already calling the future. But a storm does not respect symbols. And that was when the sea began to swallow the impossible. When the Monitor began to truly face open sea, it became clear that it was a genius trapped in a fragile body. In battle, its low height had been an advantage. It offered a small target, hit almost everything below the waterline, and forced the enemy to aim at an iron shadow. But in a storm, that same advantage became a threat. The sea did not see innovation. It saw a low lid trying to cross tall waves. Water struck the deck and ran across it as if the ship were being erased little by little. Every opening became a risk. Every crack became an enemy. Inside, the men heard the sound of the pumps working without rest, trying to expel the water that kept insisting on coming back. It was a fight with no glory, no enemy cannon, no rival flag, just the ocean, dark, cold, and patient. And that makes the fall of the Monitor even more bitter. It had survived the future of war, but it started losing to the simple physics of water entering where it should not. The ship that had stopped an armored monster was now fighting to keep breathing. The air grew heavy. The metal trembled. The deck disappeared under the waves. The crew had to choose between saving the machine or saving their own lives. Imagine being inside that. You know, this ship changed history. You know, commanders, newspapers, and politicians talk about it as proof of a new era. But in that moment, none of that matters. What matters is the sound of the water rising, the weight of iron around you, the darkness, the fear that the invention itself might become a trap. Because a wooden ship, when doomed, still gave some sense of space. There were masts, deck, ropes, boats, men running under the wind. The Monitor was different. It seemed safe because it was sealed, but when it began to sink, that enclosure became a prison. The technology that protected it in combat also made escape harder. The storm tightened its grip. The pumps could not keep up. The ship sank and rose again, as if negotiating its final minutes with the ocean. Men tried to move through the chaos, carrying the weight of exhaustion and the certainty that maybe the future had been built too fast. Then came the abandonment, not as a heroic movie decision, but as a bitter necessity. When a machine begins to die at sea, no one truly wins. You only choose what can still be saved. Part of the crew managed to escape. Others did not. And the Monitor, the ship that had faced the old logic, disappeared beneath the waves. The impossible sank. But here is the twist. It sank without being defeated as an idea. Physically, the Monitor did not last long. As a concept, it blew up the mental map of the world's navies. After it, no one could pretend nothing had happened. The battle had shown that low, armored ships armed with rotating turrets could face traditional vessels and completely change the balance of power. The entire naval world began to copy, adapt, exaggerate, and improve that idea. Other Monitors appeared. Some were used in rivers. Others protected coastlines. Some looked even stranger, with low hulls and heavy turrets, like flattened fortresses. They were not good for everything. Many suffered in open sea. Many were slow. Many depended on specific conditions. But they had a terrifying function. Deny passage, protect strategic points, and turn coastal waters into traps. It was a new logic of war. Before, naval power was strongly tied to majestic presence. A great ship impressed by its size, by the number of sails, by the row of cannons. After the Monitor, the question changed. It was no longer, how many cannons does it carry on the side? The question became, how much iron can it withstand? Does the turret rotate? Can the engine hold? Can it survive the first impact? The look of war became uglier, more industrial, and more efficient. And maybe that is the most disturbing part. The Monitor did not bring only a technical improvement. It helped kill a fantasy. War at sea stopped looking like a contest between great wooden castles and started looking like a fight between suffocating machines. Less wind, more smoke, fewer sails, more coal, less open deck, more men locked inside steel. The future arrived without romance. But that future still needed to mature. The Monitor showed the path, but it also showed the dangers. A modern warship could not be only armored. It had to sail well. It had to protect the crew. It had to resist storms. It needed better engines, better ventilation, better communication, better aim, better stability. The idea was brilliant, but the world still needed to build the structure around it. That is why it seems to have been born before the technology was ready. It anticipated the modern warship, but carried the flaws of an age still learning how to deal with steam, iron, and enclosed spaces. It was a metal prophecy, a machine saying, "This is where you are going," even if it could not get very far itself. And the engineers listened. In the following decades, rotating turrets became more sophisticated. Armor became stronger. Engines improved. Hulls were redesigned. Naval warfare went through a deep transformation. Ironclads, cruisers, pre-dreadnoughts, and later even larger giants were born from that obsession with armor, firepower, and industrial technology. But the seed was there, in that low, uncomfortable, strange ship that many had treated like an aberration. The Monitor proved that an idea does not need to be perfect to change the world. Sometimes it only needs to appear at the exact moment when the old world is cracking. It was not the most beautiful ship. It was not the safest. It was not the longest lasting. But it was a warning. And warnings, when they arrive in the middle of a war, are often stronger than monuments. Because after it, every wooden ship looked more vulnerable. Every tall hull looked more exposed. Every traditional commander looked like a man trying to defeat a factory with an ancient sword. The Monitor sank, but it took blind confidence in the past down with it. And that is the kind of shipwreck that does not end at the bottom of the sea. But after the Monitor opened that door, no one could close it. And that created a curious problem. When a technology changes war too fast, everyone tries to copy it before fully understanding it. It is like watching someone cross a glass bridge once and deciding to build an entire city on top of it. Navies began looking at the rotating turret as if it were the answer to everything. The reasoning seemed simple. If a low, small, strange ship managed to stop an armored enemy, then larger, stronger, better-armed ships could dominate any coastline. The problem is that the sea does not accept simple reasoning. It charges interest on every mistake. Several countries began building versions inspired by that idea. Some models were made for rivers, others for bays and ports. They had flattened hulls, heavy turrets, thick armor, and very little height above the water. In calm waters, they were threatening. They looked like fortresses that had learned how to float. But in open sea, many were still dangerous to their own crews. Because the same design that protected them from cannons created new risks. A very low ship offers a small target, but it also takes on water easily. A heavy turret concentrates weight. An armored hull demands stronger engines. Stronger engines demand coal, ventilation, maintenance, trained men, and interior space. And space was exactly what those ships had the least of. It was like trying to squeeze an entire factory into a floating basement. Naval warfare was entering a strange phase. It was no longer enough to be a sailor. You had to understand the machine. The man who once read wind and sail now had to listen to the boiler, feel the vibration, interpret steam, trust valves and pumps. Courage was still necessary, but courage alone no longer worked miracles. A crewman could be brave until the final second, but if the pump stopped, if the engine failed, if the ventilation died, the ship became a tomb. And that was a silent but brutal change. In old ships, the most visible enemy was the shot coming from outside. In the new world of iron, danger also lived inside. Heat, gases, pressure, fire in the machinery, boiler explosion, mechanical failure, lack of air. A battle could be lost before the first shot, simply because the technology could not survive its own ambition. The monitor had shown the direction, but it had not handed over the full map. That is why engineers began chasing an almost impossible balance. They wanted thick armor, but without making the ship too heavy. They wanted large cannons, but without destroying stability. They wanted rotating turrets, but without locking up the deck. They wanted speed, but the engines were still limited. They wanted safety, but the internal spaces felt like ovens. With every advance, a new threat appeared. If they increased the armor, the ship became slower. If they increased the engine, they needed more coal. If they added more cannons, the weight rose. If they raised the hull to face waves, it became a larger target. It was a constant negotiation with physics. And physics, unlike a king or an admiral, is not impressed by rank. It was in that environment that increasingly ambitious ships were born. Ironclads stopped being improvisations and started becoming national symbols. A country that wanted to look strong needed steel at sea. It was not enough to have an army. It was not enough to have a flag. It had to show that its industry could turn or coal, calculation, and money into floating monsters. From then on, the warship became propaganda. When a power launched a new vessel, it was not only expanding its fleet. It was telling the world, my factories work, my engineers know what they are doing, my government has money, and my enemies need to pay attention. The sea became an armed display window, and every new ship promised to be the final argument before war. But that race also carried a curse. The more expensive the ships became, the more afraid governments were to lose them. The more powerful they seemed, the more they provoked rivals. Every innovation became a threat. Every threat became a response. Every response became a new race. The Monitor had been born as an urgent solution for one specific battle, but its logic helped feed an era in which entire nations began measuring prestige in tons of steel. And the question changed again. It was no longer, does an armored ship work? Now it was, who can build the biggest, the fastest, the most armed, the most resistant? That question would lead the world to enormous machines, far more advanced, with cannons capable of hitting targets at distances unimaginable to the men who fought inside the Monitor. But behind all that evolution, the same idea kept beating like an iron heart. Survive the impact and answer with greater force. The curious thing is that the Monitor did not seem destined to inspire so much. It was too cramped, too limited, too vulnerable outside its environment. If you looked only at its short life, you might call it an incomplete experiment. But history does not measure inventions only by how long they last. It measures them by the trail they leave behind. And its trail was deep. After it, naval warfare became obsessed with protection. Wood lost its throne. Turrets gained space. Steam stopped being support and became the center. The engineer began to compete with the admiral in importance. The shipyard started to matter as much as the battlefield. And the sea, which once seemed governed by wind and courage, came to be governed also by calculation, steel, and industry. But a shadow was growing behind all of it. Because every time human beings create a weapon to prevent a tragedy, someone soon imagines a larger version of it. Then someone else imagines an even larger version. And by the time you notice, the invention that was born to save a fleet becomes a staircase toward wars that are more expensive, faster, and more devastating. The Monitor was a warning and a seed. A warning that the past could die in a single day. A seed of an era when ships would stop looking like creatures of the sea and start looking like factories of destruction sailing under national flags. And the most terrifying part is that this was only the beginning.